So, Alex, you're a researcher, you're a graphic designer, and you've recently authored the book called In the Beginning, the Epic of Anunnaki. And this is really a graphic novel which revolves around the ancient astronaut perspective or theory. Can we start by a bit of background explaining what exactly is ancient astronaut theory?
Sure. So ancient astronaut theory is basically a theory that many different researchers have come up with, linguists, archaeologists, and other types of historians, that describe Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, and an extraterrestrial species similar to humans arriving here in search for resources, eventually creating a hybrid species, which is modern man, and basically running the show ever since, or at least in the ancient history, in ancient times. Many ancient civilizations are connected to that. Sumerians are the number one culture that described them and called them the Anunnaki. They wrote about the many different gods that interacted with them and taught them all of their advanced knowledge.
Okay, great. And so could you provide just a bit of an outline about the book and what the story is presenting?
Yes, the book is a graphic novel, which means that it has all fully illustrated story along with lots of reading. And it's a two-part story. It starts off in present day. It features Zechariah Sitchin as one of the characters in the story. Basically, a Iraq war veteran comes back from the station in Iraq and approaches Zechariah Sitchin with something he found in the desert. They embark on a trip to Kuwait, which then takes them to the Iraqi desert, and their discovery leads them into translations that take place 400,000 years in the past. That story leads into the ancient astronaut theories, which depict the Anunnaki still on Nibiru, deciding the fate of their planet, the discovery of Earth, their arrival to Earth, and it also ties in with many of the stories from the book of Genesis.
Okay, now the book is actually science fiction, but many people, many researchers, even alternative archaeologists, believe that this perspective, ancient astronaut theory, is actually our true history. What's your opinion about it? I mean, you're writing about it. Do you actually believe this history yourself, that flesh and blood extraterrestrial beings came and influenced humanity in some way in our past?
Well, I write that in the intro of the book about the word belief, and basically for me, belief is something that is very vague. Some people call it faith. Some people basically base their beliefs on facts. I like to believe in possibilities, and I believe that this is a possibility that may have taken place. There are other alternatives to this possibility, but this story, when researching this theory, everything begins to connect. All the ancient civilizations that talked about their gods, all the anomalies in the ancient cultures, the descriptions of flying chariots, the description of these gods passing down knowledge, and many other facts that are out there begin to connect once you start to research this theory. So it's on the top of my list of the possibilities that may have taken place.
Mm-hmm. And are you aware of any archaeological evidence that would provide proof towards this theory?
Well, there are many archaeological pieces of evidence that tie into the theory. So, for instance, Sumerians left behind libraries of their writings, descriptions of their everyday life, descriptions of everything down to their accounting methods. But they also described these gods, the Anunnaki, that they considered gods, in detail. They described them by name. They described the way they looked. They described their advanced technologies. And that's just one example. Then there's many other civilizations, such as the Vedic culture of ancient India. They described their own set of gods. They also described flying chariots. One of their gods, Vishnu, is supposed to have an abode in the Capricorn constellation. And they also describe these advanced flying machines in detail. Now, there's so many others. I mean, there's other archaeological evidence would be the megaliths that align with different constellations or stars. For example, the Egyptians knew about a binary star system. The Hopis, many of the other South American and Native American tribes spoke about various star systems and sky ships, and the gods coming down, descending downstairs from these sky ships. Another interesting, recently there's an archaeological site which is supposedly the oldest one found in Göbekli Tepe, Turkey, is also now being theorized that it was aligned with stars and constellations. The question that comes to mind is, why would all these ancient cultures that were supposedly by the mainstream, supposedly just surviving and hunter-gatherers, why would they be so involved in astronomy and this advanced mathematics? That kind of leads back to the fact that it's possible that extraterrestrials came to Earth and taught mankind all this different knowledge.
Yeah, it's very interesting because almost every culture that has a mythology behind it, they all talk about sky beings or sky gods, and it does raise the question about why are they all referring to the same thing when supposedly these cultures didn't have any interaction with each other, and they're talking about the same thing. So it is very curious. What about biblical references? How would this theory fit in with what's mentioned in the Bible?
So that's where my book connects the most, is to the Bible stories. Basically, there's the standard accepted books of the Bible, and then there's the Apocrypha. An example of the Apocrypha is the Book of Enoch. These are books that were excluded by the early church leaders in very early times when these religions were just being formed, and they excluded many of these books. Basically said these are not considered biblical, and we don't know who wrote them, and we're not connecting them to our Bible. But these books describe, these additional books, especially the Book of Enoch, describes Enoch going into the heavens with the angels, them teaching him about the sun, the earth, the moon, the orbits. He documented in this book, and it's ascribed to him, the 365-day year, way before anybody came up with this number. That's one example. Another example is when you take a look at the stories from the book of Genesis. They're very much connected to other stories that are even more ancient from the Sumerian civilization. There's actually a school of thought called Pan-Babylonianism that came about way before Zecharia Sitchin and Eric von Daniken was another well-known researcher. This school of thought connected these stories from the book of Genesis to the Sumerian writings, like the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish. These are different books or engravings of the Sumerian culture. Their stories talk about 6 generations of gods, and on the 7th generation creating man. They talk about the gods trying to do work on earth and toiling at this work so they could not continue, and that was their reason to create mankind, to do the work of the gods. And they didn't call themselves gods. This was something that came about throughout time. There's also a parallel to the flood, the Noah's Ark. It's called the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh was actually a Sumerian king that learned about the flood prior to their civilization, and he went in search of Noah, which they called by a different name, Krishna. So in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they talk about immortality, which is what Gilgamesh was looking for. They talk about the gods, and they're also talking about in the Epic of Creation, they also talk about the gods retreating from Earth into the heavens, waiting out the storm, waiting out the flood. And these are all parallels. They're not exactly tied to the Bible, to the book of Genesis, but they're so close that even biblical scholars have had to admit that there definitely have been things taken into the Bible from these ancient scriptures.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think the whole idea of mythology is quite interesting because many people think of mythology as the imagination of our ancestors, coming up with these fanciful stories and things like that. But one by one, many of these myths, archaeologists are starting to find actual proof that they were real accounts. For example, the story of Troy was considered to be a legend, but they've now discovered the city of Troy. And one by one, all of these myths are proven as accounts that our ancestors were making of real events taking place, and they were just describing them in the way that they knew how to, according to their knowledge and understanding of that era. So when you see all these myths and legends linking up with each other, it certainly does point to the direction that perhaps there was at least some element of truth behind them. One of the sort of more controversial, or let's say sensitive, issues relating to your book is the fact that Adam and Eve are presented with dark skin, whereas, in the Bible you often see them with white skin. What would you say about that? I mean, what was the basis that made you decide to present them in that way?
Right. So although the book itself is science fiction, I tried to base it as much on the theories as well as science fact as possible. Most scientific evidence shows that early man, prior to 30,000 years ago, was dark-skinned. The genetic evidence also shows that white skin or lighter skin only came about later on. Now, if the stories are true and man was cloned from a previous being that lived on Earth, then he would have inherited that dark skin. Most of the depictions in art, especially that come from the Renaissance, depict all the biblical characters with white skin, and that's basically the European influence onto the subject. But it's not really scientifically accurate. I mean, if you just go to the Middle East or North Africa, you see that most people that are indigenous to that area have darker skin, whether it's brown or darker brown, and especially most of the natives of Africa are all dark-skinned. So, and when they find any kind of ancient skeletons from those times and analyze the DNA, they can still tell that the DNA has the person who lived in that body had dark skin. And that's why I wanted to depict it as close to reality as possible.
Yeah, that's good. So was there a lot of research involved in putting together this book? I mean, as we've talked about, it is science fiction, but the fact that you've tried to present it as accurately as possible according to science, did you have to delve into these topics in a lot of depth or consult with other historians in order to do that?
Yes, well, I actually started researching this topic over 15 years ago. I read all of Zecharia Sitchin's books, most of Eric von Daniken's books, many other books on the same subject. Jim Mars is another example. And I took notes throughout these books. Most of these books are classified as nonfiction. They have different chapters on the different elements of the theory, but they don't really tie it into a storyline. And that was my goal. My goal was to take all these pieces of evidence, all the historical fact and theory, and combine it into a story that can visualize and depict how it may have taken place. The reason I put it into classification of science fiction is because I wasn't there to experience it. Even if the theory ended up being true, I put in my own thought as far as the conversations that took place, the scenery, the characters, and so on. So the story that may come out of it may one day be proven to be true, but my story in the book is science fiction.
Yeah, and I think it's great that it really brings the theory to life. It makes it really accessible to people, and it makes people able to really see or imagine, what it could have been like. Whether this theory ends up being true or not, it still puts it in an accessible form, because a lot of the content relating to the theory can be hard to digest or hard to get your head around. So when you see it in this visual way, it sort of puts it all together in a coherent fashion, I think.
Right. Yeah, so now, I mean, I've lent many of my books to friends and acquaintances, and while many of them have found them intriguing and continue to read them, some people find them very detailed and like a textbook. So they put it down and they just don't have the time or they don't have the energy to really delve into it. And the goal of my book was to kind of put it into the storyline and give people, the idea of what something like this may have looked like.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I guess a big question that comes out of ancient astronaut theory, and I'd be interested in your perspective, is why did the Anunnaki come here? What was their reason? What was their purpose? If this theory is true, what would have been the whole purpose of this event in our history?
Well, one of the most known ancient astronaut theorists, Zecharia Sitchin, wrote in his books that they came here for gold. Others write that they came here for resources in general. Now, Zecharia Sitchin's theory on the gold is basically saying that their planet, Nibiru, which is a part of our solar system, an unknown portion of our solar system, needed gold to suspend in their atmosphere. Well, and I'm not talking about bars of gold, I'm talking about microscopic nanoparticles of gold. Needed to suspend these particles into their atmosphere to reflect and or clean their environment. They were having their own troubles on their planet, similar to what we're having now, but possibly even more down the line. And that was their solution. Because they didn't have the gold on their planet, or they didn't have it in such abundance, when they finally discovered Earth and had the means of coming here, they decided to come here and mine for that gold. Now, they assigned the certain group of their own kind to mine this gold, to collect it in various forms. And they rebelled. These people did not want to work in such a fashion. And their solution was to create a hybrid species so that it's smart enough to follow orders and depend on them, but there wouldn't be they wouldn't have the longevity of their species. They wouldn't have the advanced technologies and knowledge of their species.
Yeah, that's quite interesting because it also ties into some Bible references which refer to the tree of knowledge, and that actually it was forbidden for humans to, access or eat from the tree of knowledge, which again suggests that for some reason we weren't allowed to have a particular kind of knowledge, which does raise the question, why? What knowledge can't we have, and why couldn't we have a certain kind of knowledge? So again, that would fit in with the ancient astronaut theory, I suppose, that if you create a race of people to work, well, you don't want them to be too knowledgeable, otherwise they won't want to work. You have to keep them in that obedient state, I suppose.
Right. Well, my theory is that we weren't, what we know of as modern humans, were not the first species to be created. In my book, I depict the Neanderthals or the Denisovans, that they created them first, and those were the actual worker beings. And they were tinkering with the upgrades of the DNA. And as they upgraded it to the point where they created us, modern man, they realized what they've created, that it had its own consciousness, and it was basically almost no different than they were. And at that point, they let go and kind of let us evolve on this planet on our own, possibly injecting us with some knowledge because we didn't naturally evolve here, and we couldn't all of a sudden develop culture and writing and all of that out of nowhere. So they needed to give us a little push, a little head start, which shows that they're not much different than us. They wouldn't create this kind of being and then just let it go and let it die on its own. They had people who cared, and then they had people who didn't care. So they're very similar to the way we were. And like you mentioned, the plant of knowledge, the tree of knowledge, the tree of immortality is another one that they did not want humans to attain. And that also ties back to the Sumerian writings. So there's a lot of connections between the two.
Yeah. Now, in terms of this theory about gold, again, there should really be some archaeological evidence if this took place and there was massive mining for gold going on in our ancient past. Presumably there would be some evidence for that, of ancient gold mines, things like that. Are you aware of any gold mines that have been uncovered that perhaps date back many thousands of years ago?
Well, yes, there are some ancient gold mines that were found all over Africa. Another researcher that's been popular recently is Michael Tellinger. He's been talking about these ancient gold mines in Africa. And then when you start looking at pretty much every ancient culture has been mining or collecting gold in one form or another and treasuring it, hoarding it. To this day, we still hoard gold. Every government around the world still has their own locked up vaults of gold, basically collecting it from everyone and putting it into these vaults. Why gold? I mean, there are reasons why it's treasured, but there are other metals that are not as treasured, that are more rare. And then there are other examples throughout ancient history of gold being used for a variety of purposes. There are medieval churches that plated their stained glass windows with gold. They found later that gold would actually purify the air in the church. There are promising results of using gold nanoparticles to treat forms of cancer. So there are many reasons why the Anunnaki may have needed this gold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Now, just talking a bit about your book and the graphics of it. I know you've got a sort of graphic design background. Did you do all the graphics yourself?
Well, I'm actually the author and producer of the book, but I hired artists from all over the world. One of the two main artists were from China and from the Philippines. I had the colorists from Romania, and I had the cover artists from Argentina and California, and I worked with this team to produce all the graphics of the book. But then I have ended up taking it, putting it all together, creating the layout and the introduction and everything else you see in the book.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Now, if someone wanted to get hold of your book, how would they do that?
Right now, they can purchase it at inthebeginningthebook.com. If they search for the book's title, In the Beginning, the Book, The Epic of the Anunnaki, it can also be found on Amazon, and I will be releasing ebooks within the very near future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks very much for your time, Alex. It's been really fascinating to hear the perspective about ancient astronaut theory, and who knows, maybe more evidence will come up in the future that will turn your science fiction into a non-fiction book. We'll see what happens. Time will tell.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thanks.